The summer sun hung high over London, casting a golden hue across the wide boulevard leading up to Buckingham Palace. Tourists from all corners of the globe bustled about, cameras in hand, snapping photos of the grand gates and the immaculately dressed royal guards standing in stoic silence. The steady murmur of excited chatter filled the air, blending with the distant hum of traffic and the occasional squawk of pigeons circling overhead. Children weaved through the crowd, some sitting on their parents' shoulders, others clutching souvenirs, little plastic crowns and flags fluttering in the breeze. Among the sea of faces was a small boy, around 9 years old, with a mop of messy blonde hair and a mischievous glint in his eye. His name was Ethan, and he was visiting London for the first time with his family. Dressed in a bright red hoodie and denim shorts, he stood out against a sea of tourists clad in more muted tones. Ethan had energy to spare and very little interest in standing still. He darted between groups of tourists, his sneakers squeaking on the cobblestones, dodging legs and camera bags as he made his way to the gates. Ethan's parents trailed behind him, distracted by the guidebook in their hands and the overwhelming number of landmarks to take in. They barely noticed as he broke away and pressed his nose to the black iron bars that separated the public from the Queen's Guard. There, only a few feet away, stood one of the famous guards, tall, statuesque, and impossibly still. Dressed in his scarlet coat and bearskin hat, he looked more like a statue than a man. The rifle slung over his shoulder added an air of seriousness that most people respected without question. But Ethan wasn't like most people. He tilted his head, squinting up at the guard as if trying to see past the uniform and into the mind of the person inside. He frowned, then grinned, the kind of grin that meant trouble. A small group of tourists nearby watched him curiously, some raising their phones, sensing that the boy was about to do something memorable. Ethan began to make faces. He puffed out his cheeks, crossed his eyes, and stuck out his tongue at the guard. He waved his arms in the air dramatically, jumping up and down, trying to elicit any kind of reaction. The guard remained completely still, unmoved by the boy's antics. His posture didn't waver. His gaze didn't shift. It was as if he hadn't even seen the child, though Ethan was now only a few feet away. The boy looked around, checking to see if anyone else had noticed his performance. When a few people chuckled, he took it as encouragement. He turned back to the guard and doubled down, pretending to march stiffly back and forth in front of the gate, mimicking the soldiers' movements with exaggerated silliness. He even saluted mockingly, then burst into laughter. A couple of tourists smiled politely, while others shook their heads disapprovingly. Despite the mixed reactions, Ethan was undeterred. He was convinced that if he just tried hard enough, he could make the guard break character, even crack a smile. That would be the ultimate victory. He'd go home with the best story of their trip, how he made a Queen's Guard laugh. But the soldier remained immobile, eyes fixed forward, his expression unreadable. Ethan's antics grew bolder. He began to taunt the guard aloud, raising his voice over the crowd noise. "Why don't you say something? Are you even real?" he called out. "You just stand there like a robot." His voice was loud enough now that several more heads turned, including a few children who giggled nervously. A nearby woman murmured something to her husband about how disrespectful the boy was being. Still, Ethan's parents remained oblivious, flipping through the pages of their guidebook a few steps away. The energy in the area shifted slightly. The laughter of the crowd quieted. The cheerful buzz turned uneasy. People began to sense that the line between innocent play and rude behavior had just been crossed. A few adults started filming, intrigued by what might happen next. But Ethan, still unaware of the growing tension, continued to push. He took one step closer to the gate, standing directly in front of the guard now, his tiny fists on his hips, defiance glowing in his eyes. He was about to speak again when something unexpected happened, something that would change the entire atmosphere in an instant. Ethan stood at the edge of the crowd, his eyes locked on the imposing figure of the royal guard just beyond the black iron railings. The man's tall, bearskin hat made him look like a giant from the boy's point of view, and the polished brass buttons on his scarlet tunic glinted in the sun. To Ethan, the guard didn't seem like a real person, more like an over-decorated mannequin or a wind-up toy that had run out of energy. The rigid stillness fascinated him. He had never seen anyone so perfectly motionless, not even in school during those long assemblies where the teachers begged for silence. Drawn like a moth to a flame, Ethan slipped through a narrow gap between two distracted tourists and crossed the rope barrier that marked the unofficial boundary for onlookers. A few nearby adults noticed the boy stepping out of line, but no one stopped him. Most thought he would simply take a closer look, maybe pose for a photo, and return to his parents. But Ethan had something else in mind. He moved slowly at first, his eyes scanning the guard's expressionless face. There was not even a blink. No twitch. No movement at all. Ethan circled to the side, crouching low like he was stalking a wild animal. He grinned to himself, imagining he was a secret agent infiltrating a military base. His imagination ran wild. Maybe this wasn't just a guard, but a robot, a high-tech security device that scanned for danger. Or maybe, he thought, this was a game, and if he could break the guard's concentration, he would win a prize. That idea thrilled him. Ethan took another step forward, stopping only a few feet from the guard. He stood on his tiptoes to try to get a better look beneath the brim of the tall black hat, wondering if he could see the man's eyes. But the shadow concealed any sign of life. The guard didn't flinch, didn't even seem to notice him. Encouraged by the silence, Ethan decided to test the waters. He clapped his hands loudly, once, then twice, and then cupped his hands around his mouth and said, "Hey. You there. Do you speak English?" A couple of tourists glanced over. One man smirked and nudged his friend, pointing discreetly at the scene unfolding. Still no reaction. Ethan frowned, disappointed. Then he leaned in a little closer and called out again, this time with a teasing tone. "You're not even real, are you? You're just a statue in a funny hat." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Some of the people nearby murmured, clearly uncomfortable with how close the boy was getting. One woman muttered under her breath, "Where are this kid's parents?" But Ethan was lost in his own mission. He walked side to side in front of the guard, waving his arms like he was directing traffic. "Hello," he said, voice rising. "Earth to robot. Anyone in there?" He exaggerated every syllable like he was speaking to someone who didn't understand him. Then, with a quick glance over his shoulder to make sure he had an audience, Ethan made a bold move. He stepped even closer, close enough that the toe of his sneaker nearly touched the stone line in front of the guard's post. He stuck out his tongue dramatically, wiggling it from side to side, then danced in place like a clown. Some people laughed nervously. Others turned away, unsure of how this might end. A few phones were raised now, recording the moment, a blend of curiosity and concern on every face. Ethan, of course, took their attention as validation. He wasn't being disrespectful, he told himself. He was just having fun. No one had stopped him yet, so it couldn't be that serious. He made a silly face, crossed his eyes, then shouted, "I bet I could do your job. You just stand there all day looking bored." The guard still didn't respond, but his posture seemed just a little more rigid now, as though something inside him had snapped to alert. If Ethan noticed, he didn't care. He was too deep into his performance, too caught up in the thrill of the challenge. Behind him, a woman gasped quietly. Ethan's parents, finally noticing the commotion, began to turn their heads. But it was too late. The atmosphere was charged now. Tension rippled through the crowd as everyone waited to see what would happen next, and whether the silent figure in red would remain silent much longer. Ethan stood boldly in front of the royal guard, eyes sparkling with defiance, unaware of the tightening tension in the crowd around him. His small body was almost dwarfed by the soldier's towering presence, yet he acted as though he held the upper hand. The guard, as always, remained completely motionless. His rifle was slung neatly over his shoulder, boots polished to a mirror shine, uniform flawless. But Ethan wasn't impressed. To him, the man was just another boring adult pretending to be important, and he was determined to prove just how ridiculous this whole act really was. "Seriously," Ethan said loudly, his voice carrying over the heads of the surrounding tourists, "what do you even do all day? Just stand there like a tree." His hands were on his hips now, his stance challenging. Some of the onlookers chuckled awkwardly, while others shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene or let things unfold. The air was thick with anticipation. There was something jarring about a child speaking so brashly to a symbol of national pride, something that made even the most casual observer feel uneasy. Ethan leaned in slightly, squinting up at the guard's face. "Did they train you to be this boring?" he mocked. "Bet you don't even blink. I could stand here and be way more interesting than you." His voice dripped with sarcasm, clearly hoping to provoke even the slightest reaction. But the guard didn't move. He remained a perfect example of British discipline, unblinking, unmoved, and unshaken. A group of teenagers standing nearby began recording on their phones, hoping to catch something viral. A woman in her 50s, holding a Union Jack umbrella, muttered under her breath about how rude kids had become these days. A man beside her nodded, whispering that it was only a matter of time before the guard reacted. Yet no one stepped forward to stop the boy. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was discomfort. Or maybe it was the collective belief that surely someone, the parents, a security officer, someone official, would step in at any moment. But Ethan wasn't finished. He stepped back slightly, took a deep breath, and then shouted, "Oi! Are you deaf or just stupid?" The words cut through the air like a knife. Gasps erupted from the crowd. The playful mockery had shifted into open insult. Several adults shook their heads, clearly disapproving now, and a few even backed away, unwilling to be part of whatever might follow. A young child nearby clutched her father's hand, eyes wide, sensing that the situation was no longer funny. Still, the guard did not move. The silence that followed was almost heavier than the insult itself. It was as if time had paused. The murmurs of tourists, the sounds of traffic in the distance, even the fluttering of pigeons overhead seemed to freeze. Ethan looked around, still grinning, clearly enjoying the attention. In his young mind, he had won. He had gone further than anyone else dared, and the guard hadn't done a thing. No punishment, no lecture, just a statue in a red jacket. He turned back to the guard and spoke again, this time in a mocking tone of sympathy. "Ah, are you not allowed to talk? Poor little soldier boy, did they make you practice standing still in your room at night?" He began mimicking the guard again, snapping to attention, marching in exaggerated slow motion, then freezing with a fake stern expression. Laughter bubbled from a few members of the crowd, though it was uneasy, tinged with guilt. The atmosphere was no longer that of casual amusement, it felt like a line had been crossed, and no one knew quite how to restore balance. Ethan raised his hand and pretended to give orders like a general. "Stand up straight. Don't smile. Don't think. Be boring." He twirled in a circle and added, "That's all you guys know how to do, isn't it?" At that moment, Ethan's father finally noticed the commotion and turned toward the scene. His expression changed from confusion to alarm as he saw his son standing so close to the Queen's Guard, taunting him openly. He called out sharply, "Ethan! What are you doing?" But the boy either didn't hear or chose to ignore him. He was caught up in his moment, intoxicated by the attention, by the power he thought he held in front of an unresponsive adult. And then, just as Ethan opened his mouth to deliver one final insult, the sound of a heavy boot stomping hard onto the stone pavement shattered the tension like glass. The Royal Guard had moved. The sharp, thunderous sound of a boot striking the pavement echoed through the courtyard like a gunshot. It cut through the air with such sudden force that it startled nearly everyone within earshot. Conversations ceased mid-sentence. Camera shutters paused. Even the pigeons scattered into the air in alarm. Ethan froze, the smirk instantly wiped from his face. His mouth hung open slightly, caught between finishing his insult and trying to understand what had just happened. The Royal Guard, silent and still for so long, had taken a single, deliberate step forward, his right foot stomping hard enough to send a small cloud of dust puffing into the air from the stone beneath him. The sound reverberated through the square, a deep, authoritative thud that meant only one thing: enough was enough. Then came the voice. "Stand back," from the Queen's Guard. It wasn't just a shout. It was a command, fierce, unwavering, and so loud it seemed to rattle the iron gate and shake the ground beneath their feet. The words hung in the air like thunderclaps, leaving a stunned silence in their wake. The kind of silence that demands obedience. Ethan stumbled backward instinctively, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. He had pushed and pushed, believing the guard was incapable of breaking character. He had mistaken discipline for weakness. In that moment, he realized just how wrong he'd been. This wasn't a theme park actor or a lifeless mannequin. This was a trained soldier, a member of one of the most elite and respected regiments in the world. And now, that soldier was staring directly at him. For the first time since the taunting began, the guard's eyes were visible beneath the shadow of his bearskin hat. Cold, focused, unblinking. He hadn't moved beyond that single step forward, but his message had been delivered more powerfully than anything Ethan could have said. The crowd gasped collectively. Dozens of phones caught the moment on video, recording the boy's retreat, the guard's voice, the electric tension in the air. What had started as childish mockery had escalated into a very real and very serious confrontation. Ethan's father rushed forward, pushing through the stunned onlookers. He grabbed his son by the shoulders and pulled him away from the guard's post, his face red, part fury, part embarrassment. "What do you think you're doing?" he snapped. Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't. His heart pounded in his chest, and his ears still rang from the force of the guard's voice. The father turned to the guard and muttered an apology, but the soldier had already returned to his original position. As quickly as he had broken his stance, he had resumed it. Eyes forward, feet together, hands on his rifle, as though nothing had happened. It was almost surreal, as if that brief eruption had been imagined. But the stunned silence of the crowd said otherwise. Some tourists began whispering, others clapped quietly, as if to commend the guard's restraint and control. A few shook their heads in disapproval of the boy's behavior. No one spoke loudly. No one laughed now. The atmosphere had changed entirely. What had once been a light-hearted crowd enjoying the pageantry of royal tradition had transformed into something reverent. Respect had been re-established, not with violence, but with presence. Ethan, still pale, looked up at his father. "I didn't think he was allowed to yell," he said in a small voice. His earlier confidence had vanished. "I thought they weren't supposed to move." His father knelt beside him, gripping his shoulders firmly. "He moved because you pushed him too far," he said, voice low but stern. "You disrespected him, and your country, too. These aren't actors in costumes, Ethan. These are real soldiers, and they deserve real respect." The boy nodded, his eyes not leaving the guard. There was no defiance in his expression now, only a dawning understanding. A lesson had been delivered more clearly than any lecture or punishment could offer. As the father led his son back into the crowd, people stepped aside for them. Some nodded silently, others looked away. But Ethan didn't meet anyone's eyes. He kept his head down, still shaken, the sound of the guard's voice echoing in his mind. Behind him, the Queen's guard remained still as stone once more. The moment had passed, but its impact lingered. The courtyard outside Buckingham Palace was unusually quiet for several long seconds after the royal guard's thunderous command echoed through the air. The echo of his voice had barely faded before a wave of stunned gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. People who had been chatting casually or posing for photos were now standing still, their eyes wide, their mouths slightly open. It was as if time itself had paused, allowing the full weight of what had just occurred to sink in. The boy, Ethan, had retreated behind the rope barrier, clinging tightly to his father's side. His earlier arrogance had completely dissolved. His face, once filled with mischief and cocky defiance, was now pale and flushed with shame. But the focus of the crowd wasn't on him anymore. All eyes were on the guard. He stood motionless once more, back at attention, rifle at his shoulder, head held high. The stomp, the shout, the moment of intense authority, it was all over as quickly as it had begun. And yet the energy of the moment still lingered in the warm London air. Then the first camera shutter clicked. It was followed by another. And another. People who had been filming or taking photos throughout the scene now turned their phones toward each other, excitedly whispering, replaying what they had just captured. A group of teenagers huddled together, reviewing the video on one of their screens, pointing and laughing, not at the guard, but in awe of what they'd just seen. He actually shouted at the kid. One girl whispered, covering her mouth in shock. "I didn't even think they were allowed to talk." "They are," a man nearby said quietly. "Only when necessary. That kid pushed it too far." Social media was already buzzing. Within minutes, clips began appearing on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. Some people added dramatic background music or exaggerated captions like, "Savage Royal Guard puts rude kid in his place." Or, "He messed around, and found out." Others simply posted the video without edits, letting the moment speak for itself. Views began to climb rapidly, with comments flooding in from all over the world. Back in the courtyard, conversations resumed, but now with a different tone. The mood had shifted from light-hearted tourism to something closer to reverence and reflection. The crowd now treated the guard's post like sacred ground. People approached for pictures but did so with more caution, more respect. No one dared get too close. No one joked. Even the children seemed quieter. A young girl holding a pink camera asked her mother if she could take a picture with the guard. Her mother nodded but whispered, "Just stand a bit back. And be respectful. He's a real soldier, not a toy." The girl nodded solemnly, as though she had just been let in on a very serious secret. Others in the crowd began sharing facts about the Queen's Guard. "Did you know they have real weapons?" One man said to a group beside him. "They're trained soldiers. Some of them have seen combat. This isn't just for show." It was a moment of collective education, of mutual understanding. A strange sense of unity formed, tourists from different countries, cultures, and languages all witnessing the same powerful interaction and taking away the same lesson. Behind the tradition, the uniform, and the ceremony stands a person of discipline, responsibility, and pride. Ethan stood silently next to his father, avoiding eye contact with the strangers around him. He could feel their stares. His cheeks burned with embarrassment, but he also felt something else, a growing awareness. His father hadn't scolded him again. He didn't need to. The moment itself had done all the teaching. A nearby man gave Ethan's father a respectful nod. "He'll remember this," he said softly. "Probably for the rest of his life." The father nodded back. "That's the point." Farther down the line of guards, another soldier shifted into marching formation, signaling the upcoming ceremonial change of the guard. A buzz ran through the crowd again, but this time it was filled with admiration and quiet respect. Phones came out, but no one dared behave as Ethan had. The lesson had been learned by more than just the boy. As the new guards approached and the shift began, Ethan looked back one more time at the man he had mocked. The guard didn't look at him. He didn't blink. He had returned to his role, as silent and still as before. But Ethan knew better now. So did everyone else. Ethan's father gripped his son's shoulder firmly as they stepped back from the rope barrier, putting distance between themselves and the guard who had just shattered the silence with his commanding voice. The father's face was red, not from the sun, but from a burning mix of embarrassment, frustration, and disbelief. Tourists were still watching them. Some pointed discreetly. Others muttered to one another. Ethan kept his eyes down, his confident swagger replaced with small, reluctant steps. His mother appeared a moment later, rushing through the crowd with worry etched across her face. "What happened?" she asked, scanning her son's face, then her husband's. "Why is everyone staring?" Her husband sighed and gently turned Ethan toward her. He was taunting the guard. Teasing him. Making fun. He paused. The guard finally responded. Loudly. Ethan's mother's eyes widened as she looked down at her son. "Ethan, is that true? Did you really do that?" The boy didn't answer at first. He shifted uncomfortably, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his hoodie. "I didn't think he could move," he mumbled. "I didn't mean to make a big deal." "A big deal," she repeated sharply, her voice low but tense. "You embarrassed yourself. You disrespected a soldier doing his job. You could have gotten hurt." The father stepped in, kneeling to his son's level, lowering his voice so only his family could hear. "Ethan, do you understand that these men are not statues? They're not actors. They're real soldiers. That guard has more discipline and training than most people will ever understand." Ethan gave a small nod, still unable to meet either of their eyes. The mother crossed her arms, watching her son carefully. "You need to go back over there and say something." "What?" Ethan asked, looking up. "You need to apologize," she said firmly. "Not for show. Not because we said so. But because it's the right thing to do." Ethan's face paled even further. The idea of facing the guard again, after everything that had just happened, seemed unthinkable. His heart pounded. He glanced over at the immobile figure standing in perfect formation, once again the image of unwavering composure. "He won't respond," Ethan said, almost trying to find a way out of the situation. "Maybe not," the father said. "But that doesn't matter. You need to own your actions." They waited, giving him time to absorb their words. After a long pause, Ethan finally nodded. His legs moved slowly, almost mechanically, as he approached the rope barrier again. He didn't cross it this time. He stood just behind it, a safe distance away, and raised his voice so it would carry. "I'm sorry," he said. "I was being rude. I shouldn't have made fun of you." The guard didn't move. He didn't blink or react in any visible way. But that didn't surprise Ethan. What mattered now was the act of saying it, of acknowledging his mistake. He stood there a moment longer, then turned and walked back to his parents, who each gave a small nod of approval. The family began to move away, blending back into the crowd, which had started to thin now that the ceremony was over. Ethan's steps were quieter now, more thoughtful. His parents didn't scold him further. They didn't need to. The moment had changed him in a way no lecture or punishment could. Behind them, a few tourists gave the boy's apology a soft murmur of approval. One man quietly said to his friend, "Good on the parents for making him do that." Further along the walkway, a security officer in plain uniform passed by the family. He had witnessed the earlier scene and offered the father a subtle nod. The father nodded back, appreciative but not proud, just relieved that a lesson had been learned without anyone getting hurt. As they walked on, Ethan looked back one last time at the royal guard. He no longer saw a statue in a red coat or a silly hat. He saw discipline, strength, patience. And now, for the first time, he saw the weight of the job, the quiet honor of standing watch while others laugh, taunt, or misunderstand. He reached for his mother's hand, and she squeezed it gently. They moved forward together, leaving behind a moment that would live with them for years, not just as part of their London vacation, but as the day their son learned what respect truly means. As the family slowly moved away from the crowd, the excitement and tension of the confrontation behind them began to dissolve into something quieter, something reflective. Ethan walked in silence between his parents, his shoulders slightly hunched, his earlier energy completely gone. It wasn't just the guard's loud command that had shaken him. It was what it had revealed, that actions have weight, and words, especially unkind ones, can lead to real consequences. He hadn't expected to feel this way. When he'd started taunting the guard, it was just a game in his mind, a way to get laughs, a way to prove he was clever and daring. But now, his stomach twisted with something unfamiliar, shame. The laughter hadn't lasted, the attention hadn't felt good in the end, and the stillness of the guard, followed by that single, forceful reaction, had humbled him more than any teacher, detention, or scolding ever had. His father kept a hand on his shoulder as they walked, offering support without saying much. It wasn't the time for more lessons. The moment had already delivered the lesson in full. His mother, too, remained quiet, occasionally glancing down at her son, as if checking to make sure he was really absorbing what had happened. She could see the change in him already, not just in the way he walked but in the weight in his eyes. They passed a group of schoolchildren on a field trip, all neatly lined up, listening attentively to their tour guide as she spoke about the guards and their role in the British military. They stand watch to protect the royal residences, the guide explained. But make no mistake, they are real soldiers. Highly trained, highly respected, and they deserve to be treated that way. Ethan stopped for a moment and listened. He already knew that now. Not just because someone had told him, but because he had seen it for himself. The unwavering focus, the incredible discipline, the way the guard had remained still despite being provoked, and then reacted only when it became absolutely necessary, it all made sense now. He turned to look back once more. The guard who had shouted at him still stood in his post, unmoving, as though nothing had happened. But Ethan would never forget that voice. The suddenness of it, the power, the warning. He felt a mix of awe and guilt, realizing how much restraint that man had shown. He had the power to scare him with a single stomp and a single sentence, and yet he hadn't hurt him. He hadn't lashed out or stepped further forward. He had done exactly what he needed to do, no more. No less. For the first time in his young life, Ethan understood what it meant to carry responsibility. Not the kind of responsibility his parents talked about when they told him to clean his room or do his homework. This was different. This was about how you present yourself to the world. About standing for something. About protecting something bigger than yourself. Ethan looked up at his dad. Do you think he gets yelled at like that when he messes up? His dad smiled slightly. I think he trains so hard that he almost never messes up. That's what discipline does. Ethan nodded. I don't think I could do that. His mother looked down and said, maybe not now. But learning to respect people like him is the first step. They continued their walk toward the nearby park, where families sat on benches and couples strolled beneath leafy trees. Ethan was still quiet, but this time it wasn't because he was embarrassed. He was thinking, processing, growing. He sat down on a bench near the edge of the green, watching other tourists pass by. Some pointed at the palace. Some took selfies. Some approached the guards, carefully, respectfully. A younger boy stood where Ethan had stood earlier, but his mother held his hand tightly, keeping him at a distance. Ethan watched all of it, seeing it now with new eyes. Not as a place to joke around, but as a symbol of pride and duty. He didn't need his parents to explain anything more. The moment had done its job. Eventually, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small toy soldier he had bought earlier that day from a gift shop, a cheap souvenir he hadn't thought much about before. He looked at it differently now. With a quiet reverence, he set it carefully on the bench beside him, then smiled to himself. This wasn't just a trip to London anymore. It was the day he learned that respect is earned, given, and remembered. As the sun dipped lower in the London sky, casting a soft golden light across the grand architecture of Buckingham Palace, the crowd had mostly dispersed. The cobblestone courtyard now echoed with the sound of footsteps and the occasional distant chatter. The ceremonial change of the guard had concluded, and the excitement of the earlier confrontation had faded into the gentle hum of an ordinary summer evening. But for Ethan, the moment was still alive in his chest, echoing like a quiet drumbeat. He sat on a low stone wall at the edge of the palace grounds, his parents nearby, watching a flock of pigeons peck at crumbs scattered by another group of tourists. His mind replayed the events over and over, the taunts, the silence, the sudden stomp, the thunderous voice, and the sea of strangers staring at him. But the more he replayed it, the less it felt like humiliation, and the more it felt like a turning point. Ethan reached into his backpack and pulled out the little Union Jack flag he'd been waving earlier in the day. It was crumpled now, bent at the edges. He smoothed it out and looked at it, his fingers tracing the lines of red and white. He hadn't thought much about what it meant before. It had just been a fun prop, something everyone seemed to be buying. But now, it meant something else entirely. Something he didn't quite have the words for, but something he understood deep down. His father joined him on the wall, sitting beside him quietly. For a while, they didn't say anything. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was thoughtful, respectful. Finally, his father broke the stillness. "You know," he said gently, "there's a reason those guards don't react unless they absolutely have to." Ethan nodded without looking up. "They're taught to hold their ground no matter what," his father continued. "To stay calm, focused. Because they're not just guarding a building. They're guarding something much bigger, tradition, honor, the dignity of their country." Ethan swallowed hard. "I get it now," he said softly. "I think you do," his father replied. They sat for a moment longer before Ethan spoke again. "Do you think he'll remember me?" His dad smiled faintly. "Maybe. Or maybe you were just one of many people he's had to deal with. Either way, the question is, will you remember him?" Ethan nodded again, this time more firmly. "Yeah, I will." The setting sun cast long shadows across the palace grounds as the final few tourists lingered for pictures. Somewhere nearby, a street performer played a soft melody on a violin, adding a strangely cinematic quality to the evening. The world had moved on, but Ethan remained rooted in that feeling, a newfound respect, a deeper understanding. As they got up to leave, his mother snapped one last photo of the palace. Ethan stood beside her, hands in his pockets, eyes lingering on the last remaining guard still stationed by the gate. His expression had changed from curiosity and mischief to something much quieter, admiration. The guard remained still, expressionless, the same as always. But to Ethan, he was no longer invisible. He was no longer a target for mockery or a puzzle to be solved. He was a symbol of something strong, quiet, and deeply meaningful. They walked toward Green Park, where the city slowly began to glow in the early signs of dusk. Cars rolled by, buses filled with tourists passed, and the city of London buzzed on like it always had. But for one boy, everything felt a little bit different. As they exited the palace gates, a large screen near a souvenir shop showed a breaking news highlight, a trending video clip of the guard shouting at a disrespectful child. Though the boy's face was blurred, Ethan knew it was him. His parents paused to glance at it. No one said a word. But Ethan didn't look away. He watched it, this time as an observer, as someone seeing his own mistake from the outside. A line of bold text appeared beneath the video. "Discipline, honor, respect. These soldiers aren't actors, they're elite." Ethan stared at the words for a long moment. Then he turned, took a deep breath, and walked away, the message etched into his mind. Sometimes the most important lessons aren't taught in classrooms. They're lived. And sometimes, all it takes is a single stomp and a soldier's voice to change the way you see the world.